The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. I am welcoming this week a total stranger, actually, somebody who was referred to me. I shouldn't say total at this point. We've talked a little bit, but I am welcoming here, as you can see, Reverend Benjamin Cremer, and he is a Methodist pastor. Like I said, I'm just getting all this sorted out, but I was so excited to be referred to Pastor Cremer because he is, I'm going to just lead with this before I even let him talk. I'm just going to say, this is the kind of Christian I've been looking for. This, you guys know, if you've been following my work, that, I'm an anti-cult guy. I'm not an anti-belief guy. I'm okay with people believing what they want to believe about God and the supernatural. But I'm kind of anti-coercion, and I don't like it when people get high and mighty about their beliefs and start dictating to other people what they should do based on that person's beliefs. That's where things get a little, and I'm talking supernatural beliefs here. I'm not talking about law and order and civil unrest and that kind of thing. So, Benjamin, welcome to my show.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, let's just get to it. We just had a very brief talk before we got to recording here, and you were telling me about your background a bit. You do have a story though, because you were kind of raised in a little bit of a hardcore group. Separated from that. Why don't we go ahead and lead with introducing you to my audience? Let me also say you have a blog called Into the Gray. You are on Twitter. Your tweets are awesome. I have yet to see anything that I even slightly disagree with. It's really heavily agree with your positioning on this, because you tend to tell the hardcore evangelical literalist type Christians who feel it's their duty to dictate to everybody else how to act. You're the guy going, hey, could you tone it down? Could you bring the levels down a little bit? Maybe that's not the greatest representation of our faith. So I'm on board. So why don't you describe for the audience who you are and what you're about?
Well, I think you framed it so well. I tell people all the time that I'm actually writing to my former self, because I was a very extreme literalist, evangelical Christian. And I would say I was more of the fundamentalist sect, which is even more extreme on the literal words of Scripture being God's literal word in the world. And everyone had to abide by it. Not just me, not just my friends who believed it too, but everyone in the world needed to abide by it if God was going to favor our nation, favor other people. It was my mission in the world to have other people conform to that way of living and thinking. And so that's at the center of why I write the way that I do, is because I not only advocated that sort of coercive faith, but I was also harmed by it myself, my family. I saw how psychologically damaging it was, how it really damaged people's sense of self-worth. I think a really good comparison is when Jesus says to love your neighbor as yourself. What happens when you hate yourself and you go to love other people?
Oh, good question. Right. Yeah.
So a lot of the theology in fundamentalist and evangelical perspectives, they are taught a sense of self-loathing. You are a worthless sinner. You are hated by God until you accept Jesus as Lord. But even then, you still need to continue to work to bring about God's favor in your life. And you need to understand how worthless you are so you can understand how great God is. So once that narrative is accepted, the way that you love non-believers is through that sense of self-loathing, right? And so it even shapes the way we understand our own theology and the very words of Christ, who we claim to be the leader of our religion.
Oh, that is a really insightful sort of analysis there of the psychology of that, because you're absolutely right. When you're leading with a core belief that you are worthless, that you have no value other than, whatever value is given to you through, I guess, a minister telling you, this is God's plan, or God's value of you is I'm gonna tell it to you. Then it sets up a real dependency on the church, on the minister, on the group for your sense of self-worth. And that's, I don't think there's a single psychologist in the world who would think that that's a good idea.
No, I mean, I feel like that is the starting point for a cult. You can tell me wrong, but ingraining that sense of dependency and worthlessness, and that you can only have salvation through what we have to give you. Not only is it creating that cultural codependency, but it's very lucrative for the person who advocates that.
Yes, it is.
You get to sustain your movement really well when you have a bunch of people thinking their eternal, not just their life today, but their eternal salvation depends on their dependency to what you have to say in your organization.
I'm going to say something really funny right now, because it's only because of the way you've worded this and put this today that it's occurred to me the parallels between televangelism Christianity, we could say, that hardcore money grubbing level of it, and Scientology, and I grew up in Scientology. I was part of Scientology for a lot of years, and it was the major driving force in my life. And we had what you just said could describe me too. When people are dictating to you that your eternity depends on following what we tell you to do, that's Scientology. They literally put it that way. They say if you go off the rails or break the rules or are otherwise in trouble with the Church of Scientology, they'll tell you your eternity is at risk right now. And that is basically the equivalent in that world of your eternal salvation, your immortality even. So it strikes, it's sort of the ultimate threat, because it's not just I'm going to hurt you or cut you or even kill you this lifetime, but your entire eternity is at stake. That raises the stakes so much higher.
Well, you can't have that equivalent of fear attached to anything else. When you think, because you don't know, we've never been on the other side of death. No one has been able. Well, there was this one guy who came back. But no one has really been on the other side of death to come back and tell us what it's like.
That's right.
And so it is you take a huge unknown as eternity, and then you wrap it around this fear that if you don't have this is what your eternity is going to be like. And gosh, you have a bunch of willing, innocent people who are putting their lives in your hands, saying, okay, I don't want it's out of good intention, right? Because we all have hunger for connection and value and purpose in this world. And to then exploit that based on this fear perspective of eternity is just, I think it's at the heart of every coercive version of religion that we see in the world.
Big time. I could not agree with you more. And it's interesting, because what would you say? There are more than a couple people on my side of the atheist fence, you could say, who, and I've ceased being, years ago, being this like hardcore militant kind of, how dare you think those stupid things, you ignorant theist. That's not me. And I was that way for a little while, but it was a phase. We'll put it that way.
Yeah. Isn't it exhausting?
Oh, it's so exhausting, because it consumes so much of your energy, and
so much. Yeah.
And keeping hate going, or keeping, that kind of ill will going towards people who have not done anything wrong to you is a silly, silly, silly thing to do.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to have moved on past that, and I've been openly critical many, many, many times of the more militant side of the atheist equation. Yet, what do we say to people who quite legitimately point out example after example after example of biblical literalists, young earth creationists, hardcore, Protestant, old school. If you're not giving everything, you suck, and you are, you must humble yourself before God daily, which means you have to submit and be coerced and be controlled in all these ways. This represents, this view, this idea of Christianity is something that a lot of people in the atheist world rail against. I think a lot of them came out of that world in a way similar to how you did, and their response to it is, oh, that's horrible, that's evil, that's bad. And yet I struggle with, but it's not all of Christianity by any stretch. So how do we look at this? I'm going to assume you're probably more familiar with the sort of demographics of the Christian world than I am, and I've always struggled to understand the terminology of evangelicals, Protestants, Presbyterians, Methodists. Who's who here? How am I supposed to know the guys who are all the way at the end of the right wing extremist, one step away from the KKK versus your totally cool regular Christians who don't have anything wrong, don't have any problem at all. What words am I supposed to use, or how do I think about the demographics of this?
Gosh, that is such an excellent question. And that is honestly one of the topics I feel like I think about all the time, that like, if we just had a better understanding of the diversity of movements, even just within our own culture, I think it would give us better dialogue or vocabulary to navigate it. Maybe just a real quick synopsis is I think there's this myth that Christianity is a monolith, and that myth is propagated by a lot of Christians, that there's one way to be a Christian. There always has been one way to be a Christian, because you hear that from both inside Christianity and the critics of Christianity, right? So it's like, look at Western Christianity, look at the slavery, the genocide, the Inquisitions, all of these things that Christianity has done in the world. I'm like, okay, that's Western Christianity. Have we looked at Ethiopian Christianity, the Coptic Christians, the Christians that are dying because of their religious beliefs in the Middle East right now? Some of the oldest sects of Christianity in the world that are being persecuted. We're not talking about them, are we? Do Amish Christians come to mind when we are critiquing? I don't think they come to mind either, right? The pacifist Christian, the Jesuits in the Catholic sect, like I don't think these movements come to mind when we're railing against Christianity. What we think about, and our Muslim friends would tell us as well, that like, do not reduce our religion to our extremists, right? And I think every religion has its fringe movements of literalists and extremists that then take the reputation of the entire religion with them, right? And so I'll just take my tradition. I'm part of the Wesleyan Arminian tradition. I stumbled, and I'll trace it backwards, stumbled into the Church of the Nazarene when I was a senior in high school. Church of the Nazarene broke off from the Methodist Church in early 1900s. The Methodist Church traces its roots all the way back to an Anglican priest, Church of England, named John Wesley, who didn't want to start a new denomination, wanted to start a revival or movement within the Anglican Church. So before the United States was even officially the United States, Methodism began. John Wesley was part of the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, which only started because the king wanted to get a divorce, and so he didn't want to be Catholic anymore, right? And so there you have it. We're back to the Catholic Church, right? But even the Catholic Church has its position in the world because it fused itself with imperial power, through Constantine, right? So, but that's one sect. So that's one sect of Christianity. You don't have the monastic movement without all of the movements of Christianity that opposed crawling into bed with Constantine. You don't have Justin the Martyr. You don't have all of these prophetic voices saying that we are not called to be the empire. Jesus said his kingdom is not of this world, and that kingdom is of this world. Like, you are betraying the witness of our crucified Messiah who gave his life for us. You are betraying his witness by crawling into bed against the very empire that crucified him. Like, so like,
wow.
The first 3 centuries of the early church was a persecuted movement that was exploding because of its radical inclusion and love for the poor. It's upholding minority communities within Rome, and they could not get a grasp on it. So they started persecuting them in the Colosseum. But then Constantine came along, had this conversion, which I think is more politically motivated than anything else because of the numbers of Christianity, saying, hey, we could just have more control over this burgeoning movement if one of the leaders was one of them. Right?
I've often wondered about this. I've wondered about this origin story. Thank you for clarifying that. Sorry for interrupting. Please go on.
No, that's okay. So that's many scholars could disagree or agree with that.
Sure.
But that's my consensus after studying church history, that it was more politically advantageous because the Christian community had exploded to such an extent.
Right.
It's more proactive to be one of them to move the movement rather than to be against them and try to persecute them out, which they had been doing
for quite a while now, right? A couple hundred years, and it wasn't working.
Yeah. But why? So there again, so we're back to early Christian, ancient Christian roots. There again, you have the Church of Paul, you have the Church of Mark, you have the Coptic Christians started because of Mark. You have John's church, you have Ethiopian Christians already moving that were in Africa, not even associated near Rome, right? So you have a diversity of sects even then. Right. It's not even a monolith from the beginning. Right. And even so, Jesus was Jewish, not a Christian, right? So you have him as a reformer in his own faith. That's why he's talking to Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots, those different movements within Judaism, which is also not a monolith, right? And so if we trace it back to our understandings of who Jesus was, wanting to reform a faith that had become dogmatic and coercive. What are all the words that he says? I have come to set you free. Right. What's the metaphor of religious learning? A yoke. And he says, I have come, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. I have come to liberate you. Why was Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated? Because he was upholding unions to liberate people who are financially strapped and stuck in systemic poverty. You want to start getting a target on your back, you start questioning how people handle their money and their power. And you start heading towards the cross really fast.
That's right.
And so that's why Jesus was crucified, because he was liberating the poor. Luke 4:19, he says, I have come to bring good news to the poor, to heal the sick, liberate the oppressed, and set the captives free, proclaiming the Lord's favor, which is the year of Jubilee, which is complete debt forgiveness for all of those suffering under debt bondage, which was the most prominent form of slavery of the time. Like, Jesus is turning over the tables of who? Money changers.
Exactly.
Right? Like, literally critiquing the ways in which money and power were handled towards the least of those in his community at the time. And he was killed not for proclaiming the condemnation of sin, but for forgiving it, holding sin over the people, right? And so, like, when you understand that, you become a radical that Christians often don't like. It's like, no, I want to be like Jesus here and now. Look at the systemic oppression. Look at how our economic systems are exploiting people. Like, and you start asking those kinds of questions, even people in your religion start to look at you as if you're a heretic.
Right. I get that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
And there's all the influences you listed out there are obvious, are make total sense to me. And historically that fits in. I know that a lot of the, just to go down this road for a second, and then we'll
sure
come back to more modern.
And I feel like to answer your question more simply, there's over 200 different sects of Christianity within the United States alone.
Yep.
All with their own theological identity, interpretations of scripture, and things like that.
Yep.
And I would say what we're seeing right now in Christian nationalism is a small minority that has gained a lot of power.
That's where I wanted to go.
Yeah, over the last 50 years, in the moral majority, the fundamentalist evangelical movement, that's the distinct, and it draws itself from a more neo-Calvinist, double predestination, tulip theology, dominion theology. Dominionism is the theological roots of that movement. And so it has a very distinct character.
And thank you for that word, because dominionism, seven mountains, Christian nationalists, evangelicals, these have been words that I've been using roughly synonymously, but I know they're not all exactly the same at all. And evangelical is the word I've been most nervous about, because lacking the degree of familiarity you have with this world, I know there's a lot of different groups who identify as quote unquote evangelical, who may not be hardcore literalists or whatever. I think Mormons identify as evangelical, and Mormons I kind of consider as a separate thing because of their separate and unique dogma. Let's put it that way. And very culty social practices. I consider the Mormon Church a destructive cult in and of itself, but a late stage one, you might say. They've been around for a few hundred years, and so they've had to mainstream and tone down their blatant racism and sexism and some of that kind of stuff, and changing over the last 50 years as a result. But they're still pretty culty, and they still do stuff with kids that isn't really too cool. But I don't spread that. I try to focus my Mormon criticism on Mormons, and my evangelical criticism of Christian nationalism and dominionism as a separate thing, maybe. I'm not sure how many Mormons are on board with this whole dominionism theology. Are they related? Just because I'm curious, and since it came up, are these things, do you know if these things are related, those two groups?
The evangelicals and Dominion?
No, Dominionism and the Mormon Church. Do you know if the Mormons are subscribing to Dominionism do you know?
I think what has been helpful for me is that you can have a name of a religious group that you're part of, but ascribe to a certain theology, right? And so I've seen Dominionism being advocated by Catholics, by Muslims, even by people in the Mormon religion. And so I think those nuances are really often overlooked, where it's like on the surface, they may call themselves a Lutheran or a Presbyterian, but ascribe to a very evangelical dominionist theology.
Yeah, and I think this is at the heart of my original question of trying to parse out, because you can't go, okay, 7 million Mormons, right? Or roughly, however many there are. I think it's around 7 million. But how many of them would subscribe to, a dominionism worldview? Would that be the way I would put that? And so, do we even know? Are there any numbers anywhere, a census anywhere? Does anybody survey this kind of thing?
Yeah. So Dr. Samuel Perry, I don't know if you've heard of him. He writes for Time Magazine. He's an incredible religious scholar, but he and my friend Andrew Whitehead co-authored a book called Taking America Back for God. And they are sociologists. So they look at statistical data of identifying markers, how people self-identify, the kind of language that they use. And so once you look into those statistics, you see that it's not as cut and dry as maybe we'd like it to be. Even recent statistics on the word evangelical, because words, I'm sure, as you know, they evolve over time, right? Depending on our context, a word can take on a different meaning. Evangelicals at the beginning of the United States would be considered the progressives. So Methodists were evangelical. The word evangelical comes from the Greek evangelon, which is like advocating for our belief, right? We are evangelizing. We are embodying or living out our faith. So you have Methodists who are abolitionists on the front of women's suffrage movement, radical care and love for the poor, very social justice oriented. And that's what you see in Methodists, many Methodists today. We tie social justice with our faith in very intrinsic ways. So here's the interesting thing though. Before the Civil War, the evangelical movement was leading these huge Great Awakenings. You had this massive revival all over the United States because they deeply believed that they were going to conquer slavery, right? And so this religious hysteria and fervor was just capturing people by the thousands, because they really did believe they were going to conquer this systemic evil. They were going to bring God's kingdom here on earth. And then slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation was given, and slaves were not fully released. It wasn't until 3 years later that they were even released fully in every state, right? That's why we have Juneteenth. It's like, that's finally when the last slaves were set free. But then we don't see them given land or property or valued as human beings. We have a huge white backlash against slavery. And so the evangelical movement, which was a largely white movement, lost its hope. And that's when they started believing in the rapture. That's when the rapture. So you see this huge shift in theology. It's like, well, God doesn't really want to save and change this world. It's going to hell, obviously. Because then you had the Titanic sinking. You see World War I come along.
World War II, right.
Right, exactly. It's just going to go to hell in a handbasket.
Right.
So God must be wanting to take us out. And so you have this withdrawing from society where theology isn't used for the betterment of humanity. It's just to save your soul so that God can save.
Oh my goodness. Do you know what this coincides with? This is so funny. Let me throw something else at you in the mix of the analysis of this, because I've often wondered how and why televangelism and prosperity gospel could take such root in this country. It's not a thing that happens in England or in Europe. They don't have these televangelists over there.
So perceptive, yeah.
And you wonder what's up with that. Well, there's another thing which I happen to know something about, which is not usually tied in with this. And let me throw this at you and see what you think. In the 1920s, there was the rise of a number of popular speakers and motivational type speakers, some religious, some not. And there was this one guy who had three names in his 3 words in his name. I can't remember who it was, but he had this very popular radio show, and he was this very motivational guy. But at the same time that was happening, and this sort of motivational speaking was happening on religious channels, Dale Carnegie publishes How to Win Friends and Influence People. And our culture, not just because of that one book, but because of an attitude that began pervading the American psyche, it was an attitude of, or a sort of persona of salesmanship. Everybody kind of became salespeople. Now, this went with the rise of the beginnings of the multi-level marketing schemes. The very first one was back in the 20s and 30s, and it was a vitamin production company. Before vitamins were even really a thing, MLMs are what made vitamins and the entire supplement industry a thing. Before this first MLM, there was no such thing. There was snake oil. But there weren't vitamins and minerals and supplements, and you had to have them, and your doctor was prescribing them. None of that was going on. It was it was the sales-driven side of this.
You're going to make me a conspiracy theorist.
I know, right? It's almost it's a confluence of events more so than a conspiracy, but it's so interesting that this sales attitude that every single individual had to make friends and influence people. How do you do it? By selling yourself, by smiling, by creating this alternate persona of yourself. And that's how we're going to, and I'm going to sell you things, or I'm going to sell you myself, or sell you on who I am. You know, this whole attitude. Yeah. And it pervades and pervades and pervades. And this is going concurrent with, I think you could probably speak to, the fundamentalist movement at the turn of the century, because the word cult in its current incarnation comes out of fundamentalism.
Oh, it does. I didn't know that.
The fundamentalists who had gone back and literally rewritten the fundamentals of Christianity at the turn of the century were using the word cult and cultist to describe people who weren't fundamentalists. And they were the cultists. All you Christians out there who aren't hardcore fundamentalists, yeah, you're all the cultists. And with the sales change of our society and this sort of, glad handing, smiling, prosperity sort of gospel that comes out of the world wars and the reaction to the horror of it, people doubled down on individuality, self-importance, and getting mine before anybody else gets it. And this very, this hard, rugged individualism that personifies the American psyche kind of took a dark turn, Yeah. That's my assessment.
I think that's spot on. I'm forgetting the book that I'm reading, but it's talking about the psychological and theological components of free market capitalism and how much of those things influenced religion and religion influenced it. Right. And so you have this, I think that's just such a spot on characteristic because when religions start to see themselves as in competition, which the free market naturally does, then you start saying, well, if I market myself or I sell myself more, I'm going to have, more people join my movement and those sorts of things. So I think it's a spot on assessment for sure.
Yeah, I think that was key to this whole thing. And of course, with the revivals, the tent revivals and the money that started coming in on this. It goes from let's service the poor and let's do religious good works to this is a way certain unethical scammers, right, who rise to positions of power, and this happens across the boards. This isn't just with religion.
Oh yeah.
This happens in politics. This happens in sports. This happens in entertainment. Right. But it's particularly egregious in religion, I think, because of the moral component. Right here, we have people who are who are stating they are the moral leaders, and yet here they are, raiding the donation plates and this kind of thing. So we have this kind of rise of this, but we have a society that is becoming more selfish, and as a result, it becomes more acceptable, and prosperity gospel, takes hold. Sort of a side note, really, but I think it's part of the picture, and I thought I'd throw that past you and see what you thought.
Yeah.
So coming back to my initial question, though, because I really want to just keep poking your brain about this. So if we have, so let's go back to dominionism for a second, right? If we're, because I consider that we're talking today because of that, because of that extreme fringe group of people who do have power now, or are trying to get hold of a lot more power right now, ideologically, right? I want to be clear about what we're talking about and who we're talking about. So what is your understanding of, or how would you describe dominionism?
I would say that, dominionism sees the submission of all segments of society to what it believes to be God's will as the only thing that will bring the nations of the world into God's favor so that Christ will return.
Okay.
And so there's this deep intention there that unless the world, there's premillennialism and amillennialism, and I always get the terms mixed up, but one of those theological perspectives is that either the world's going to get worse before Christ returns or better. And they err on the side of it's going to get better, and we have to play a significant central role to the world getting better. And they define what better looks like, which is every segment of society, education, entertainment, the government, all segments of the family. Like, that's why you hear so much talk about the family and how that should be defined, gender roles, those sorts of things. It all has to fall under this hierarchy of God's omnipotent sovereign power for Christ to come back and establish his kingdom on earth.
Okay, so this then is an idea then that rather than opposite of the folks who are like, oh, this ain't happening, we just have to prepare for the rapture, we're just going to have to buckle down and just do that. These guys on the other hand are more of no, we need to take things into our own hands and we need to make this happen. And that's their point. Their thing is a more proactive.
Exactly right. That God rules with an iron. Like, you'll hear lots of really heavy ruling metaphors of God's omnipotence and sovereignty, because it's rooted in that neo-Calvinism that God has predestined all things from the beginning of time, even who's going to be damned and who's going to be saved. And so we have to implement that sovereign reign of God through law, through every segment of society, so that we can experience God's favor, and Christ will see it as a time to return.
Okay, and now there's an obvious question. I mean, this begs many questions, but the first one that I have to ask, just theologically or philosophically, is everything is predestination. Everything's already decided and worked out, and who's going to be saved and isn't is already worked out. And there are many, many groups who have these ideas. This isn't just a Christian idea.
Exactly. Yeah.
But predestination is a thing. And if that's so heavily a thing, then why the proactivity? Why isn't it all just fated to happen no matter what we do?
Well, because of the influx of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism sees a world that's filled with binaries, right?
Oh.
And one of the biggest things that fell apart for me as a fundamentalist learning theology is that the Bible never says that Satan or evil is as bad as God is good. God is all powerful, and Satan and evil are like these things, these mosquito bites trying to poke at you. Like that's the kind of power they have to influence and motivate you, maybe, but they're not as bad and evil as God is good, right? That's very Greek dualistic thinking. But fundamentalism very much sees the world that way. And so when you have a whole religious movement that sees evil in government, evil in all sectors of society, the erosion of family, all of these things, then you are at risk of prolonging Christ's return. You are at risk of not receiving God's favor on all the nations of the world, especially your own. And so you have to take a proactive role in standing against that kind of evil. Otherwise, your favor with God might be at risk as well. You are not living into that call that God has put on your life.
Okay, so this is a very, I'm going to relate this to the Crusades then. This sounds very Crusader-like as an attitude. Is that, that's right?
I have made the comparison to Crusaders and the Inquisitions. Like, gosh, I'm missing authors' names today. I apologize for that.
No worries.
There's a book, a fantastic book called Reclaiming the Art of Scripture, and it looks at the very first scriptures written on Chinese tortoise shells, all the way through to the Sanskrit, the Hebrew faith, the Christian faith, all of the faiths of the world. It's an extraordinary book. But one of the things that she highlights in that book is that right before the Crusades began, again, a fringe Christian sect that had a lot of power. In Jerusalem at the time, you had Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in relative harmany with each other. And the Crusaders came and killed them all. Right.
It reminds me an awful lot of 1800s Israel, to be honest with you. That whole area, people were living together, and then suddenly, a group of folks showed up and said, "No, this is ours," and the killing began.
And you see the same thing happen with every human atrocity. After World War II was over, some Nazis moved to Rwanda and began implementing this idea of different nose sizes. Like, you see that same stupid Nazi propaganda comparing the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes together, which then sparked the Rwandan genocide. So this idea of they're living in perfect harmony. They didn't know that they were different and that one was less superior than the other until this horrible, coercive, extremist ideology moved in and started convincing people you're different and it's all a power play.
Yeah.
Right?
That's it.
It's not seeking the betterment or the welfare of other people. It's saying we have to have a hierarchy and we're at the top of it. These people are below, but they're a threat to the people at top. So we need to get rid of them. Like once you start demonizing people, you're no longer advocating for God. Like I've come to that just maybe broad strokes conclusion. If you are demonizing other people, you are not advocating anything of Jesus. Just leave Jesus out of it, because that's not what you're talking about.
Preach, man. I'm telling you, I'm here for it. I am here for it. Because I could not agree with you more. And I come at it from a psychological rather than theological perspective, but same page. I cannot conceive of a world where the Christian God described to me in the Bible is the guy who takes sides, and is the guy who wants my baseball team to win, and is the guy who wants is on our side, right? I mean, we all are aware of the fact, I hope, that the Germans in World War II had belt buckles that said God, in uns is God is with us.
Yeah. Oh, right? Yeah.
They absolutely believed. They were not an atheist movement. That is the most underplayed. Like Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of my biggest influences, and the one thing that I've learned from him is that we American Christians literally never get educated how prominently Hitler used Christianity to underscore and fuel his movement. It was not an atheist movement. He literally said in several speeches, we need to restore the Christian spirit of our country and burn out all the liberalism that we've gone into over the recent years in media, in education. Like, it is almost word for word to some of the rhetoric that we're hearing today. Yeah, I was just going to say.
Terrifying.
It is very terrifying, which has led to these conversations. There are reasons to be concerned about these things. History doesn't repeat, it echoes.
It rhymes. Yeah,
rhymes. Absolutely. That's right, as Mark Twain put it, right? And we are seeing that. I've been asked many, many times over the years about cult leaders, authoritarians, the dictator types, right? And how do they study one another? And the answer really is that sometimes they do, but it's not necessary, because there's only so many ways to control people. And authoritarian, predatory types figure those things out in childhood. They figure that out early in life. Here's how to motivate people, scare people, con people, do this, do that. They just experiment until they figure it out. And the good ones figure it out. Those are the ones. Those are the names and we've
really good.
Yeah. And we've got this right now. We've got a very, very big problem, leaning sort of authoritarian problem right now. And there are left leaning authoritarian problems. Don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
Right now we're in a place
that's
where
not our context.
That's right.
Now, right.
Exactly. Yes. So looking at there's sort of some of the, one of the biggest quandaries with people, and I think we're right on the topic, but let's go back into this a bit on dominionism. Does this relate, by the way, are you aware of how this is connected with something called, what is the Seven Mountain?
Seven Mountain Mandate. And
yes. That's same, right?
Yeah. Same thing. Yeah. It comes, R.J. Rushdoony is probably the one that made dominionism mainstream.
Yeah.
And Seven Mountains comes from his sort of philosophy of the world, where God's reign needs to be established over the seven mountains of society, which is entertainment, government, education, the family, and there's some others that they economy that they go into that God's will has to have sovereign reign over.
Okay, so that because you sort of referred to that earlier, and I wondered if you were referring to the Seven Mountains Mandate, because this is because I've talked with a man named Dr. Clint Haycock, who used to be an evangelical minister, part of this movement as well. We've done a few podcasts about this stuff. And so everything I've learned about this has mostly been from him and from independent reading. And you're confirming everything we've talked about. So I'm wondering, this seems to be the core belief set, you could say, because am I right that I think you said earlier, dominionism is cross-denominational, right? It goes across different
Yeah. And
groups.
so is evangelical now.
Yeah,
Like the
okay.
recent stats show that it's more of a political affiliation than it is a religious one. So that's how that term has shifted now since, because it looks nothing like the evangelical forebears who were for women's suffrage and abolition of slavery, those sorts of things.
Right.
It has shifted to a more political affiliation, because even a percentage of Muslims and I forget which Mormons affiliate with evangelicalism, but it's politically affiliated rather than theological.
How interesting. What could you talk more about that? As to, we know, well, I know, but I don't know that my audience really knows a whole lot about the shift in the 70s, 80s, 90s with moral majority and with the folks who Jerry Falwell and the political connections that were made. Is this sort of the origin story of this, or what could you speak to that?
Yeah, I would. It was a few factors that led to kind of the coalescing of the moral majority, and you can really trace it back. Obviously, the founding of fundamentalism, the German scholar critique of the Bible, led to the fundamentalist backlash. But then that all came to a peak with teaching evolution in public schools and the Scopes monkey trial.
Right.
And fundamentalists were nationally, for the first time, utterly humiliated and shamed.
That's
and
right.
If you look at all of the papers and the tabloids, they were relentlessly mocked for their anti-intellectualism, their lack of knowledge about even their own Bible and things like that, all while saying that they were the fundamental movement in the world. And they just they suffered a humiliating defeat. So they went into hiding. That's when you start seeing all of the Bob Jones universities and the private schools starting to take place. And then you had desegregation. Movement starting. It became national law, and Bob Jones University specifically brought that to court because they didn't want to desegregate. They wanted to keep Black people out of their school and keep the races separate. And that's what led to the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education that forced, if they wanted to retain their nonprofit status, they had to desegregate. And so that then Mr. Wyrick, I'm forgetting his first name, but Wyrick thought, okay, here is a movement. We are being attacked. We're being marginalized as a religious movement after Brown versus Board of Education, but we can't use racism to coalesce the movement.
Yes, right. That's right.
So what issue should we pick?
Yep. This is how it started, folks. What issue?
What issue should we pick to rally the masses? The evangelicals who are so fed up with being marginalized, the fundamentalists who have been utterly humiliated. This is a voting block, because at that point they were apolitical. Can you believe that? Evangelicals and fundamentalists were apolitical. They didn't want anything to do with politics. They were rare voters at best. And Wyrick saw the potential to start a new political movement to instate his philosophy of dominionism in the world and in our nation. And so he picked abortion as the issue to rally them. And that's the issue that Reagan ran on. And so ever since 50 plus years, we have seen that be the central issue for evangelical Christians. But it took years. Even after Roe versus Wade, Christianity Today, the flagship magazine that Billy Graham even founded, said, we really think this is a good thing. This should be left up to the right of the woman to decide.
That's right.
It's not even Jerry Falwell, the ardent fundamentalist, didn't start preaching against abortion until like 5 years later after Roe versus Wade. So it wasn't even this like intentional, oh my gosh, look at what's happening in the courts, we got to stop. No. They didn't care until it became their issue to rally people. But there's a great book by Randall Balmer, the religious scholar, called Bad Faith. And it's what the recent documentary called Bad Faith, the Christian nationalism's unholy war against democracy. Like, you've got to see that documentary. I encourage all of your listeners to either read the book Bad Faith or watch the documentary. But it shows this in great detail about how that was the rallying cry. But they still had desegregation perspectives. They still, had this same kind of racialized view of Christianity and those sorts of things. And we still see notes, again, rhyming of that history here and now with a lot of the political movement that we're seeing today.
Does that make, here's a really blunt question, because you're going to know more than I will. I would assume so, but I don't want to assume so when it comes to this. Are we dealing with a group of people who are religiously or religious-backed racism? Is this a pervading characteristic of this group? Because the things you just talked about are all historically accurate. Absolutely, I will corroborate everything you just said about the abortion issue and the racism and segregation. That's all true. But it leads me to wonder: are these people who are so adherent to this view now, this moral majority, as they dared to call themselves?
Yeah.
Are these people in the main racists?
I think I'll use my own personal story.
Sure.
Because I grew up, I would say that my faith system, my worldview was racist, because I would hear racist jokes from the pulpit and think nothing of it. And they were horrible. Like some of the jokes that my pastor would tell, but it's that kind of racism where it's just like, oh, that's normal. Every race has their certain characteristics. Like this race is more lazy, or this race has less of a work ethic, or white people have their problems too. We're not being racist, or whatever. But like now looking back, I'm just like, that was really racist. That the way that we carried ourselves and thought about our race in relation to others. And gosh, I grew up in Idaho, 95% white. And guess what? It's still that ratio today, even though it's continued to grow by people moving here leaps and bounds. It's staying at that same percentage of whiteness for a particular reason. We can get into that maybe on a different podcast.
Sure.
There are these racial components, and I think it comes down to party affiliation as well, because you see a large majority of Black people relating with the Democratic Party because they've seen Democrats fighting for them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And they've seen social policies that have benefited them. And so that's why you see this stark racial divide between parties. So when the moral majority started demonizing Democrats, they didn't have to demonize Black people.
Right. It's all part of the picture.
It's baked into it's all part of the picture. So
that's right.
When you hate Democrats, and which is all the language you hear, I was told you can't be a Democrat and be a Christian growing up.
I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask, in your culture, was that a thing? Because I've heard and read and talked with others recently who said, you wouldn't even think about it. It would be, what are you talking about? You're going to vote for Democrat. What?
Yeah.
And it's not even an issue point. It's a cultural identity point. Yeah.
Well, once you've manipulated the abortion issue and homosexuality to such an extent that I deeply believed it was leading to the downfall of our world.
Right. So that's how I see it with these guys. Right. Yeah.
And I think that's the distinction, which I think you pointed to earlier, like distinguishing between the cult and cult members, right?
Yep.
Distinguishing between religious and ideologies to the people that are within them. These are good-hearted people with the best of intentions, but believe really bad things.
Yeah.
Right? That make them affiliate because they believe they're doing the right thing. I don't want innocent babies to die. No one wants that. Right. But then once I learned that, Democrats don't want that either. They're going about the issue differently. Abortion rates start to decline once we start to dismantle poverty, increase education and understanding about our bodies and access to good wages and uplift. Abortion rates go down. what? Like that blew my mind, right?
Isn't it? It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? And yet it completely makes sense.
Counterintuitive.
That's right.
Because along with that, you have these, again, narratives of demonization. You're demonizing women for their selfish choices. You're putting this huge moral responsibility over their sexual ethic of how they dress, how they conduct themselves. And so you're demonizing women under the guise of protecting the unborn. But again, it leads back to this definition of family that they're trying to enforce. So rather than, as a Wesleyan, upholding women's rights, we have been ordaining women since before the United States was the United States, right? So this has been a core part of our theological foundation from the beginning. We are going to uphold women's rights and be a movement that wants to decrease the amount of abortions in the world. Because even, what are the statistics? Over 75% of women who've had abortions in our country identify as Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. Because 75% of our country identifies as Christian. This isn't like some bizarre outlier who's having abortions. Right. Christians, just like everybody else. That's who.
Just like everyone else.
Yeah.
But adding to that, they're sitting in our pews, not permitted to talk about it because they know they're going to be demonized for it and shamed because we don't understand the issue correctly.
Yep.
So we understand fear. We have fear about the issue. And the same is true with homosexuality and a whole host of other things. The conspiratorial theology that has been part of the evangelical mindset since the origins of the rapture has made people like me grow up fearing the world, fearing the government, fearing my neighbor for what they are going to do to me. And I have to stand up for my faith to take this nation back for God so that I can feel safe and so that my family can feel safe. So it really comes down to fear. Like we've really stoked people's fear against these other groups rather than seeing them as our neighbors to be loved. Like the first time I ever met someone who ever had an abortion, I was 34 years old.
Wow.
Before somebody was able to tell me safely and tell me their story one-on-one. 34 years old. But guess what? I absolutely, in my mind, hated people who had abortions because of how I believed about it. Right. And now I'm in a state with one of the most extreme abortion bans. We have 2 OBGYNs in rural counties of Idaho closed down already. Doctors are leaving here. They're afraid to move here because of the extreme laws around these things. We've had women life flighted from hospitals to other states because they're at risk of bleeding to death on hospital tables. And this is, as a Christian who used to be fundamentalist and evangelical, I can't in good moral conscience say that wasn't our fault.
I hear you on that. And
that's part of my religious group.
Yeah.
That pushed so hard for this issue, thinking that we were doing the right things by people telling us that we were doing the right things, all for the sake of their own power and control.
Exactly.
Now, the pro-life movement is watching women bleed to death.
Isn't that crazy?
And having to be life flight and abandoning rural counties without an OBGYN to give birth safely and effectively.
I mean, it's backwards world, isn't it?
It is it makes you feel like you're going insane.
Yeah. Yeah.
Watching these things.
That's the sort of dissociation or unreality that happens when you're bumping up against a cultic group.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We all feel it. We feel this weirdness. It's like when you walk into a church of Scientology or something, it's like it feels a little different and the vibe is different, so to speak. The energy is different. And I'm not some spiritual karmic guy, right? I'm not talking about your third eye. I just mean it feels different because it is different because you're dealing with people whose reality is, it's a little glassy eyed, they're not really looking at reality. And we get to say things like that because exactly as you said, the stark reality is here's a woman bleeding out on the table. Yay, pro-life. These two things are incompatible. They're mutually exclusive, And
the same group that I was part of, the same Christian group will say the government cannot infringe on my right to own a gun.
Right.
It is up to me and myself to own this firearm. Great. It's your freedom as a citizen under the Constitution to do that. So why do you want the state to have the last say in a woman's rights when it comes to one of the most complicated parts of human life, which is birth?
That's right.
So like, why? Like, so even the logic of the issue, it doesn't make sense when you look at it, the complexity of these issues. And so I think that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm using those issues as the example of saying we come to these really extreme, fear-based, demonizing perspectives about people we don't even know.
Yes.
That has death consequences for people in our culture, and yet we are claiming to advocate the way of life.
Exactly. I think you nailed it with a couple things you've said here so far. One, and you've said it a few times, and you're absolutely on it. It's fear. It's fear-based thinking. It's an entire culture that is sort of, culture, it's the same thing. You're inducing fear. It's fear mongering, right?
Yeah.
And it's decades of this. Understand, this is multi-generational. This is relentless propaganda through, willing media channels, not just Fox News. I'm sure, you have religious stations, you have religious news stations, you have blogs, videos, YouTube channels. You've got this whole culture reinforcing this message with each other. And that's where power is, because when people are telling it to each other, the leader doesn't have to anymore. Right now, they're doing all his work for him.
Right. You'll see it. You'll see the destruction of your faith in the opening ceremonies of the Olympics.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You'll see this. The worlds are gathering together to attack my Christian faith. Do you see that? That mockery of my faith. So leaders don't even have to say it anymore.
That's right.
They will just let the world be the world because they've sown these seeds of distrust, hate, and fear towards people who live differently than they do. And so you've already demonized these people, and the narratives just play out themselves, right?
That's right. You got it exactly. And it must really be something for you as a believer, one who was in that world and then comes out of it, to see, as I see with cults, just the corruption of the intent of original writings and source materials and information, enlightenment materials or critical thinking materials. I see fundamentalists talk about how critical thinking is a tool of the devil. And you just your head wants to explode. You're just like, what? This is how to become a better Christian, not how to become a tool of Satan. But but they've been so indoctrinated into this fear-based view of the world, which also makes it make sense to me why they would be so pro Second Amendment. These are people who are living lives of quiet terror, and sometimes maybe not so quiet.
Right.
Could you speak to that a little bit more? Because I'm curious, you were in that world, both to what is that mindset like on a day-to-day, and then I have another question for you, basically about maybe how to address that, or how do we talk to those people, or is there any way to bring the levels down? I know I'm not talking about doing full-blown interventions here. We don't have the resources for that. But are there phrases or ideas or things we can do that might like bring the levels down a little bit,
Yeah. And so I'll start with the first part of your question. Day to day, I grew up on the Left Behind series, which, if you've ever heard of it, right? That's the whole, man.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to
be read before bedtime, right? Like, but that book, that series became almost akin to theological doctrine. Yeah. And it, like, reading it now, it is so conspiratorial. It sets the world stage, right? Yep. Using American government as the chosen land, and like the embassy in Jerusalem, like all of these things that are just laid into fundamentalist theology. It takes it and turns it into entertainment, but the guy who writes it really believes in this too. So it's like, it's hard to separate what they believe to be truth from this fiction account, right? So they can call it fiction, but it's really their perspective of how things are going to end in the end times. And so many Christians armed themselves, ready for this battle of Armageddon, all these things, because you had to fight tyranny and stand up for your faith, for your loved ones, all of those things, especially if you're the kind of person that gets left behind. And so, in the homeschooling movement that I was part of, I was reloading shelves in the garage and had canned food on the wall, just like those kind of things that you would imagine, right? And my parents are good. My dad's an engineer. So it's not like they were unthinking, mindless automatons. The sinister part of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, I believe, and this is true for any coercive religion, is it sets loving people against each other.
Bingo.
It manipulates love. And I think that is the most...
I'm sorry.
It's the most sinister part of that. Like, yes. Loving people and turns them against each other because of love.
Yeah.
So that was my day-to-day experience about that. And how I talk to it now, because my parents have come along with me in my faith journey. Like they are not who they were before. And my parents' willingness and openness to change has consistently been a humble reminder that, one, the people that you love don't always have to stay where they are, but that openness can really bring about change in people's lives. It really can. And so everybody's context might be different. The way I talk to people about it is through this language of fear. A lot of my family members that were wrapped up in that conspiratorial way of thinking, I focused on my care for them. Because you can't, again, like we said at the beginning of our time together, I'm against forcing my beliefs on people. So I'm not going to tell them that their beliefs are stupid. That doesn't change my mind. Oh, my beliefs are dumb. You're right. I'm going to change my mind now. Right? Yep. I'm not going to demonize them because they're demonizing other people. Just like scripture says, that's repaying evil with evil, right? I'm trying to do a good thing in the name of evil. So what I need to do then is back up and see how much I actually genuinely care about them. Because if I don't love them, then I'm not fit to be in a relationship with them, right? So I need to understand that my genuine care and compassion for them. And then once you understand that and look at them through that lens, then I was able to say to them, I don't like what this fear is doing to you psychologically. It feels like your life is so full of fear that you're anxious all the time. Can you help me understand that a little bit better? And yes. I've had multiple times people break down crying because they have never been given permission to let go of their fear.
Right.
Like because it's in that mindset, it is up to you to make the world a better place. It is completely up to you to save your nation. That's so much friggin' pressure. Like for you to save your entire nation in God's name? Like, no, Jesus is our savior for a reason. You're not the savior. You can let that go, right? And so like being able to come alongside them and literally release them of that burden, that pressure they feel, to save everything and talk about what they need. And that right there is the first step to change I've seen in multiple people where they were able to just a little bit let go of their fear so that they can rest from that.
I love what you just said. That is brilliant. That gives me a whole nother approach as well, which I just love because it's pointing out, not calling out, it's pointing out very accurately and right to the core of the emotional problem that's driving the thing. Mm-hmm. Because you can't, because one thing for sure, and I've spoken about for a long time now, I've spoken about, how to use questions or a sort of a more Socratic method, we call it street epistemology, to sort of dig into people's beliefs and ideas, not with the mind of dominating their mind or enforcing change, but becoming incredibly curious about their ideas and why they believe what they believe and why they believe what they believe. And drilling down on that path is a very interesting path. It's a more frontal lobe approach. But I love what you're talking about because who wants to be miserable? Who wants to be afraid all the time? Unless you've been so indoctrinated that you believe, and people do, that is the proper way to be. That's the that this is how I'm supposed to be for God or something, right? Or for Jesus. I thought that in Scientology. I was laughing so much and so happy about what you were saying there, because I carried a burden of a savior complex as a Scientologist, as a Sea Org member. For decades, we believed we were the ones saving the planet. Scientology for us wasn't about making money. It was about saving the world. And oh yeah, very much so. That was the narrative that I bought into. 17 years old. You're going to save the world. Really? Yeah. You're going to do it. We have the methods, we have the means, we have the technology. We are going to do it. And you're going to be a key part of that. I couldn't have heard a more powerful message as a 17-year-old coming out of high school. No way. What? From adults. Right. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it aligns with where I was going to exactly. Emotional needs. Purpose, meaning, identity, sociality, right? Community. All of these you can categorize it different ways, but we all have emotional needs. We have to fulfill these things. And it's not a rational thing. It's not talking somebody out of it, but hitting them right on the emotion. That is I like that approach, because I think that is another way of opening a conversation. And obviously you'd have to do that with somebody who there is an established degree of trust or a pre-existing relationship of some kind. I don't think you could just walk up to some Christian on a street and go, "You're afraid. What's wrong?" I don't think that's gonna work too good. I really
care about you, stranger who I've never met. Right? You can't do that. Yeah,
you can't do that.
And that's really like when we're thinking about systemic change on this front. It really is, I think, taking the good parts of evangelism and equipping people to do that in their personal relationships. Because if everyone was able to empathize with each other, see the emotional toll that is, everyone who is a friend or a loved one who's involved in conspiracy theories, every single one of them talks about that. It starts to rip their lives apart.
Yep, that's right.
And have that emotional toll, that anxiety. And it's just like, if we could speak to that fear and set them free, if people had at least one person in their lives who cared enough about them to say, "I don't want you living in fear anymore." Like, imagine the change that could happen if we were able to do that.
Absolutely. That's a really good one. And be prepared if you start throwing that around at your friends or family or something. You better be prepared for the sparks to fly, because you're going deep, fast. I mean, that's not a shallow approach.
No, it's not a fast approach. Like, it took years for the people closest to me. And like, that's why now it's not an instantaneous change. I always think just 1 degree at a time. If I can just move the dial 1 degree in this conversation and not even end the conversation, end it with a question, be like, "Well, I see where you're coming from, but I've really felt like I don't know how to explain this, but this is where I'm feeling for this issue. I don't have all the answers, but this is kind of where I'm at right now. And, maybe I'll understand it better in the future." Like, it's tearing down that need to be certain.
Yes.
Which for a people of faith is really ironic.
Yes, exactly. Another topic.
To be certain about your faith? I thought you were a people of faith, not certainty, right?
Oh, that is so good. That's another very loaded word on this channel. I've spoken at length about certainty. Did you know that Scientology is the science of certainty, according to L. Ron Hubbard?
No, I did not know that phrase. Yeah. Wow. The science of certainty.
That's right. The religious science of certainty.
No.
Yeah. No. Oh, yeah. When you start equating these things, you get fervor and you get extremism.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. You can't help. That's the recipe. It's the cocktail for it.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. It is the recipe. And I think what you and I are both independently trying to do is sort of, bring down the temperature of that extremism,
Exactly.
And people will target, and this is the mistake. This is the mistake that the atheists make, that a lot of people make out there in the world, is they target the belief. And It's so right adjacent to the truth, but it's not totally that. It's not just the belief, it's how the belief is delivered, and it is the emotion and the certainty that accompanies the belief that drives the extremism.
Absolutely.
You know?
That's so good. So I have a funny phrase I just heard recently. I saw it around social media for a while, but I just love the contrast. There's a phrase I hate that Christians use. And they use it as a justification to hate people, but it's love the sinner, hate the sin.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
We also have hate the belief, not the believer.
I was just going to say that. Yeah. Like that twisting is so good because that's actually the right approach. Like hate the belief, not the believer. So like, but you're not, and maybe it isn't the best phrase to fit because now that I think about it, we're not targeting the belief, right? We're not reducing that person to their belief because who deserves to be reduced to one belief?
Exactly.
Like, human beings are so much more complex and nuanced and beautiful than a single belief that you disagree with, right?
That's right.
So like understanding and humanizing the person, and I'll tell Christians this all the time. Our entire Bible starts out with every human being created in God's image. Our entire Bible starts that way. So when you start treating people as if they're worthless sinners, you're starting after the fall of humanity rather than before it. You're not defining them by God's intention. You're defining it by brokenness and evil. Like then you're seeing every human being as evil. That's not our theology. That's not where the Bible starts. And then you have Jesus, God becoming human, seeing humanity so beautiful that God decided to become one, to live like us, to do what? Take over Rome and install God's will through political power? No. Washing feet, serving the poor, not riding a war horse into town, riding a donkey, not picking up a sword, taking up a cross. Every single antithetical move to the ways of power that we see in this world, Jesus did the opposite to show the power of love. And so if with those two strands, that's the center of the gospel, this is the beginning of the Bible. Now, fill in the rest with your theology, keeping those things in line. Every human being is created in God's image. You will not meet someone who isn't a representation of the divine in the world.
Right.
Like that core, I think, could change the face of Christianity right now. And understanding that it is so ironic to pursue power over everyone by claiming to follow a crucified Messiah.
I know, right?
Like, you can't get more ironic than that. Like, it is a different definition of power that he embodied in the world. And so that's when I'm talking to Christians and trying to move the dial and move the fear, just like these things don't add up to what we claim to believe.
Right.
In our Bible. If you want to take the Bible literally, great. Here are some passages to take literally.
Right. Right. No, I'll tell you, it's a good approach if you're familiar and if you're a former believer or a believer at all, or even now, with your fellow believers, because you can talk more intelligently than say I could. I haven't read the Bible. I'm not familiar with it the way you or other believers are. And why would I be? You're not familiar with Dianetics the way I am, right? So, exactly. It's just what we have.
No, I'm an expert on everything. I have Google, Chris.
Right. I'm sorry, of course. Sorry to invalidate your greatness there. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. But the point, of course, being that, you just made a great point, because often arguments against believers that I've observed, and I don't have I'm not the past master at this. I've just seen what I've seen. But what I have seen from a lot of in the atheist world is an awful lot of, well, this and this and this are historically inaccurate in the Bible, therefore the whole thing is bullshit. Well, I don't think that's true. And I don't think that that's going to get you anywhere arguing with theists, right? Right. But the thing you just said about challenging the behavior based on the works. Now that I like, because then you have fellow believers talking to fellow believers, which is what I've been advocating for years. It's like I've been saying, we need other Christians of a more moderate nature to talk to their extremist friends and go, hey man, what's it going to do how about we lower the dial a little bit here,
Yeah.
And this is a great way to do it. Do you have any
I
other?
couldn't agree more.
Do you have any other suggestions along those lines? Because so far it's about 1,000.
Suggestions for talking to our more extreme. I really do. I think it's a lot of having to do, like, the first thing that comes to mind when you said that is energy reserves, because like it can be like understanding that I need personal emotional boundaries as well, and saying, okay, I just can't have that conversation right now. Like, I know that I will live outside my value of being a kind, humble person if I have that conversation right now, right? So it's really understanding your limitations as well. I can't have a savior complex trying to approach other people with their savior complex, right?
Yeah.
And so I think there really needs to be a give and take. Like, as a former fundamentalist, like, my goal is not to be fundamentalist in the opposite direction, right?
Perfect.
I don't want to be so opposite of those beliefs that I become a fundamentalist in the opposite way. And so it really is this desire to see, look at the good things that our faith has brought into the world. Can you find a hospital without a saint's name associated with it? It's because of a reason of our hospitality towards the poor, the sick, the marginalized, that we have seen some really good, I mean, Christians playing into the educational advances, Sir Francis Bacon, like all of these great minds that were part of the Christian faith. Like, why can't we look at the good parts of our faith and see how we can embody them ourselves? But we can't have these conversations without understanding our own limitations as well. Like, I can't think all of myself trying to change someone who thinks all about themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Those are great points, and totally parallel so many things I've said here in the past. I want to ask you about maybe one other thing, which is not a small thing. So maybe let's talk about this for a minute, and then we'll see where we go. Okay. Because I got to bring this up right now, because we're in the time period where this is a hot topic, and where it should be a hot topic, and where it's something that needs to be a hot topic. And here I'm talking about Project 2025. Sure. You're familiar. You've seen it. You've tweeted about it. How concerned should we in the non-believing, non-Project 2025 evangelical world be over that? Because my assessment is that there are people who are hardcore believers in and want that agenda to be carried out to the letter, and that some of those people are very tight in the right-wing circles right now. Is that a correct assessment according to how you see things?
So it is produced and put out by the Heritage Foundation. Mm. The Heritage Foundation has its roots in Paul Weirich's movement that started the moral majority. So you honestly can't separate Project 2025 from the moral majority, the dominionism, and the Seven Mountains Mandate. When you're reading through the document, and I've read almost all of it. And I think one of my critiques because social media, I mean, even some of my well-meaning friends who I believe so many similar things, some of the memes and stuff about Project 2025 miss the actual meaning of it. And because I think we can fearmonger about stuff that is fearful too, right?
Of course. So, sure.
My desire is truth, to really understand. And I think it's so important to understand what Project 2025 says rather than what other people are saying about it, right? Going to the source. I think that's just good scientific work, right? We have a hypothesis, we need to go and test the source. And so there's a great few pages on Verify This, which is a fact-checking page that fact checks a lot of the claims being made about Project 2025 and goes to the exact wording of it, which has really equipped me to have better conversations about it. But back to your question, reading it as I do think the fear is justified because it is the culmination of the dominionist playbook. it involves education, the seven mountains, and the domination for a particular group. I mean, I grew up hearing that whoever relied on the government was lazy and didn't have personal responsibility, which is like a huge value in that movement, right? And yet this movement wants to make Christian values everyone else's responsibility, right? So you have, so what does that mean? That's what I was told growing up. Does that mean the same thing? Like you're wanting to make these sets of Christian values in this sect everyone else's responsibility to live out in this nation, whether they believe it or not, right?
That's right.
And so you see that in the language of family, promoting companies to promote and hire heterosexual governments promoting heterosexual versions of the family. I mean, you even hear language that associates with that recently from politicians about people who have kids should have more of a right to vote, or
yes, J.D. Vance said that.
Weight.
That's right.
Right. So like that is, you see those threads and elements wanting to become policy in Project 2025, cutting Social Security, which has been demonized often by the right as taking away people's personal responsibility, right? And so you see the gutting of the DOJ, installing a lot of these people to go after their political opponents, right? So it's weaponizing a lot of these areas of government to initiate what the moral majority has been wanting to do since Paul Weyrich, which is to dominate every sector of society for God, reclaim it for God, and put Christians, predominantly white Christian men, in positions of power to take this land back for God. And so I would say that there's a lot of misplaced fear about it, but there's a lot of good reason to be fearful about it too, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, fair enough. What would you give as an example right now? Because you did take great pains to say that there's, bad information out there about it.
Yes. Yeah.
Like what? Yeah. What would be an example of something you've seen?
And maybe I'm splitting hairs, but one of the phrases, one of the phrases that I've seen recycled through social media is that Project 2025 is going to make homosexuality illegal.
Oh, okay.
Right? And if you take the policies to their end result, you will have a culture that pushes homosexuality to the fringes, right?
Right.
Of course, they want to overturn the right to be married, those sorts of things. But the phrase making it illegal is not in Project 2025. Like, it's not like there's this hype of, because in the Old Testament, there's this in dominionism theology. If you're going to be literalist, stoning homosexual people to death is part of how they read the Bible, right? And so that genuine fear of literalists getting power and wanting to institute that kind of, you'll even hear pastors right here in Boise preaching that same horrid rhetoric against LGBT people about wanting them to be executed. So like that fear is valid and real, even in my town where I live right now. But then to project that fear onto Project 2025 as if it says those things, the only reason I say that is because it expels our energy in the wrong direction and causes people to carry stress that they don't need to carry, and distracts us from what we really do need to be like focused on.
Absolutely.
In Project 2025.
Absolutely.
I hope that clarifies it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, I couldn't agree more. No, I get it. Okay. I definitely get it. And I don't see it as splitting hairs. I see it as being precise. And
precision is what I'm after.
Yeah. And I think that's a correct way to be these days, especially with the amount of misinformation and frankly propaganda that flies around.
So much propaganda.
So much, right? We are inundated.
You can't look at either side of the political spectrum and say that only one side's, tempted to fall into propaganda. No. When you tie ratings to money, propaganda is going to be be the kind of the leading
no, yellow journalism has been the order of the day, since the early 1900s, but unfortunately it's been the order of the internet day since the 80s, when the Fairness Act doctrine was taken apart, and other Reagan-esque things that happened during that time period, in parallel to the rise of the moral majority and the Christian alliance, right? That happened with right. church and state. And I think that's where I wanted to go with this, in terms of maybe the last thing I want to ask you about today, because I got to tell you, I have really enjoyed talking with you.
I have too. This has been wonderful. Hopefully I didn't get too preachy.
No. Listen, you have been the most preachy guest I've ever had, and I've been here for it every minute. So we're fine. Okay. Yeah, we're fine. This is what I get for inviting a pastor onto my show.
Exactly. So. I'm sorry. It's a job hazard.
Of course. I don't doubt. I have no problem with it. If anything, it's refreshing. Now, correct on Project 2025. Let's be precise about it. Let's criticize exactly what it is that they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, one step leads to another. And as you said, you can see how certain proponents of this are just, a hair's breadth away from internment camps for gays, and let's just kill them all, because that's what, Leviticus tells us. So, fine, right? I get that, but that's not what's written in the public policies at this time. We get that
at this time, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Fair enough. Still something we need to fight back against. And you have gone on record. You have gone on record a couple times in your tweets and whatnot about the separation of church and state. You seem to be a strong proponent of keeping them separate. There are many in the religious world, we'll say, especially in the evangelical world, who openly and blatantly want to tear it down. They want no wall between church and state. They want a theocracy, in other words.
Yeah.
Am I being too strong in saying that? And and is it fear that's driving them to, or quest for power, or is there something else going on there as you see it?
So, there's so much going on. Some of the, Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they've gone to churches and people of their ilk have gone to churches and said that it was never in the Constitution. It needs to be kicked out as in a stupid letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote, and it's never been part of who we are. So, the church needs to dictate the government. And I think it's more... Oftentimes, I can't tell if they really believe that or if they're saying that because their constituents do. Because of, again, it goes back to, you want this large group of people to support you. So you're just going to say the right things of what you're hearing them say and advocate, right? And so if you have a dominionist group of Christians that you're wanting their vote, and you have depended on them for so long to get you into power, you are going to advocate separation of church and state because they really do believe the church should dictate the state. That's what the Puritans believed, right? That's one of the reasons why they came to this country, is because they didn't want the Church of England dictating them. They wanted their version of church dictating the governance of the land, right?
Yeah.
And so that's been a thread throughout American life in Christianity, in various sects throughout our history. And so I would say the distinction there is, there are politicians, I think, who do believe that, right? But I think oftentimes they say it to get the votes of movements of Christians that they want their support to support and endorse them, who want the separation of church and state. And I would say the Heritage Foundation, its theological roots in dominionism, you can't say that it has ever believed in the separation of church and state when dominion is their goal, right? That is the dominion of what they believe the church to be.
Right. Would you classify that? Because I would, but I'm curious about, would you classify that as an anti-American attitude?
Oh, absolutely. You can't have a group of people who left a Christian nation to come and found another one.
Right.
Among the founding fathers, and granted, they didn't get it all right. with like the slavery issue, the Indigenous American issue, women, like there was a whole group of people that when they said each person is endowed with inalienable rights, they meant people who look just like us and own land, right? Like that's what they were thinking, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things they didn't get right, but they had a diversity of Christians and non-believers in that room signing that. And deism was the leading sect of Christianity at the time that believed that God wasn't really involved in our inner workings here. And so even George Washington, his pastor, wrote in his journal, it's really hard to have a prominent person like George Washington refusing to take communion or call Jesus Lord, because like deists didn't believe those things, right? So you can't even say that they would fit into the evangelical mold of Christianity today, which a lot of people want to advocate, right? We sanitize and shape the founding fathers to look like our kind of Christian today, which it wasn't that way at all. A lot of the language was used, again, because when you have a society that's largely religious, you're gonna use religious language to get people unified on board for a greater goal. But it says endowed by their creator. It uses the most generic language possible for a religious leaning society.
That's right.
And so I would say that the separation of church and state, like that freedom of religion, in the very First Amendment, like I don't feel like you can read that and say, oh yeah, they wrote that, but they really want this group of Christians to control everything.
Exactly. It's not a nudge, nudge, wink, wink situation from the Constitutional Congress.
No.
It wasn't like that. There's a reason
why they didn't put Puritans in charge of things.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, there's a reason. That's right. All right.
Puritans were there. Why weren't they in charge of things?
Why would that be? Let's circle around back to the very first question I asked you, because I still don't think I have an answer to it, and I really want to get it out of you. And that is, how big of a problem is this here in the United States? Let me put it this way. We estimate in the ex-Scientology world, for example, that there are somewhere around 30,000 Scientologists in the world today. They tell you there are millions of them. Sure, and I know the numbers. I've seen them. There's never been millions of Scientologists. They never have been. They just lie. They just lie as easily as they breathe about their numbers because they want to be more impressive, right?
Right.
There are people who will, in their fear and exasperation and upset with the situation, overgeneralize. Surprise. And you hear things like, half the country wants Trump. Well, that's not true. And it's never been true. He's lost every popular vote he's ever had. And and half the country doesn't even come out to vote. So
I cannot believe that.
I know. I can't either. It is
like, are you paying attention?
I know, right? Like, you have a voice, use it. What is your problem? But, this sort of preached defeatism and learned helplessness that is the result of years of propaganda from other countries and from our own, internal nonsense, Russia, China. These guys have been very busy at this. Not conspiracy theory. Just go read up some stuff on the from the DOJ. You'll find criminal prosecutions even of this stuff. Okay, anyway. Point is, just because a group says there's a lot of people or there's an impression there's a lot of people doesn't necessarily mean that there is. And I've always struggled with this. You have a far more inside view of it than I do. If you were going to put a number to this, as best as you could, right? My best number for Scientologists is 30,000. There could be 50. There could be 100.
Yeah.
We don't really know. It's not like they're transparent and there's census figures. We estimate.
Yeah.
But it's an educated and it's a pretty good guess. I'm pretty sure I'm pretty close.
Yeah.
What would you say the extent of this problem of dominionism is?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And again, I'm not a sociologist, and I would really encourage anyone who wants to, Samuel Perry is doing daily work on these issues, Dr. Samuel Perry. Find him on Twitter. You can find his work through Time Magazine. He writes on Time Magazine, and he does statistical analysis all the time. And what his work shows is that it's a minority movement. It always has been a minority movement. It doesn't speak for all of Christians, and it certainly doesn't speak for all of Americans, right? Like, the majority of Americans are not Christian nationalists, right? So Christian nationalism, though, like, even then, do you listen? There's this great podcast called On the Media, and they interviewed, and they actually look at the nature of media in our society. I think it's brilliant because it's the media talking about itself, trying to be more self-aware. It's really, really good. But they interviewed Matthew. I'm forgetting his last name, but he is writing a book called I think he just published it, called The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that's threatening our democracy. And it's a powerful, powerful book, and I can't wait to read it. But he was on that show talking about how there's Christian nationalism light. Like, there are the people who have the American flag t-shirts and God Bless America on their cars. They really do believe that Jesus, Christianity founded this country and the Bible inspired the Constitution, but they're not the kind that's going to show up on the Capitol steps of January 6th.
Right.
So the Christian nationalism light, it's the good-hearted people who are working hard, trying to, pay the rent, provide for their families, but they have this belief about the Christian origins of the United States. Then there's the really hardcore group who want power, and that's what we've really seen. It's a minority group that has gained a substantial amount of power on the Supreme Court, in Oklahoma, Louisiana, my state, various areas. Like, they go to the grassroots movements, school board meetings, local elections, all of these things, to try to take Moscow, Idaho is a perfect example where they are literally trying to take that town over. A church, Christ Church, is trying to take that town over. And they want to do that with the rest of the nation as well, through this dominionist lens. So the movement itself, I would say 30% of Christians.
That's a lot.
That's
a lot.
That's why you see 80% of white evangelicals supported Trump both elections so far. Right. And so I think that gives you probably the clearest picture of how many of the movement there is. Because, and honestly, like, I know this, like, movements like Scientology have a long history and stuff like this. So it makes sense when you have a movement that has been working, networking. The moral majority has big oil backing.
Right.
So you can't have that amount of money and interest in your religious movement to not have made some inroads in some really powerful places, right?
That's right.
So, like, that's why, to me, like, I wouldn't have started writing publicly. I wouldn't have started preaching the way that I do. Like, being raised in this movement myself, I wouldn't start, like, ringing the siren if I didn't think that there is a movement that is threatening our democracy for its own takeover, right? And we've been witnessing that. But again, I want to be precise about it, right? And so again, I would say the 80% mark of those who voted in that election, both those elections, give you a really good indication of how big the movement is. But honestly, at the church level, even then, I heard the phrase, I'm going to plug my nose and vote for Trump, like, because they believe so much that the other side is killing babies and encouraging, like, horrible sexual activity. They're, like, drinking the blood of infants, or, like, when you've, like, made it so bad, you're like, well, they don't look as evil in comparison, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh,
So,
it's absolutely the
right.
doctrine of the lesser of two evils has dominated our political discourse for years now.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's what they have in their favor, is that they have a lot of well-meaning people who literally feel like they morally can't justify voting for the other side that kills babies.
Right.
We have to vote for this side because it's the one that wants to save life, and so, but they wouldn't identify themselves as Christian nationalists.
Right.
But
Right.
the Christian nationalists know that they can use that lever to get more people on their vote because they can't morally justify voting for the other side.
All right. Ugh. I mean, isn't it horrible when you can see what's going on and you understand why, but other than your voice, there's not a lot you can do about it. You kind of want to.
It makes you feel hopeless, but I've felt more hopeful, and maybe it's naive. Like, I've felt more hopeful in the last few weeks than I have in a really, really long time.
Me too.
And I've been seeing a shift in the church. I've been seeing a shift in the dialogue of Christians, which is where I always spend my time, and I think people are really, really tired of the politics of hate.
Good. I think you're right. I think you're right. There's an exhaustion point psychologically that we can look at here too. Yeah. It's not just a matter of culture wars and religion. There are some, my lens, of course, is psychology, right? And I'm always going to go there. But I see UK, I see France rejecting authoritarianism right now. Mm-hmm. And I see an exhaustion that is starting to really set in with people, that they are just getting tired of how much energy they have to rev up. As you mentioned earlier, it's exhausting to stay hateful.
Yeah,
it is. I've been there. I mean, it is exhausting. And you want to just move on from it. You want to just stop having to be afraid and angry all the time. And you start looking at, wait a minute, why do I feel this way all the time? Because this fucking guy won't stop telling me to be afraid and angry all the time.
Exactly, all the time.
And they start twigging on. They start going, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not that bad, Because let me say, I mean, you, me, we just met. We're having a perfectly nice conversation. Yeah. People out there that you meet, you can have a perfectly wonderful, conversation, relationship with people. We're not at each other's throats at the grocery store or at the Piggly Wiggly or whatever. Why do we have to be living as though we are, with all the political divides and social media culture war stuff? We just get so upset with each other. And I think we're all getting a little tired of it. So I'm
exhausted.
I'm hopeful that is the case as well. Mm-hmm. And I think the last couple of weeks has been indicative of that psychological state, because look at the resurgence on the left right now, and the right's fumbling about, not quite knowing what to do. They'll get their stuff together and they'll figure something out. Mm-hmm. They always do. And it's going to be pretty low, and they're going to go low and low and low and low, because that's what's kind of where they're at. But I think that all this energy that's happening right now in our country of excitement is that backlash starting, and I'm hopeful too. That's a word that I'm has been not a word I've been real familiar with for a while.
Yeah, same. Yeah, it was really taking its toll on me,
wasn't it,
for a long time? Yeah,
it's exhausting.
It really is.
So maybe out of just sheer exhaustion, we'll just stop, and as a nation, I mean, what I mean? I got, we'll just stop.
Let's pull the plug out, let it reset for a minute, plug it back in.
Can we just take a break? Can we just connect? It's ding ding. Can I go back to my corner for a minute?
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, Ben, I really want to thank you for taking some time with me today and sharing your thoughts, because they're valuable thoughts, and I think your voice has influence, and I hope more people listen.
I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the work you're doing. I can't wait to go. I only listened to a couple of episodes of your podcast, but it's so intriguing. Like, very people who weren't involved in a cult. Maybe I had, cultish influences, but to hear your perspective, I think is really, really vital. And people who have experienced similar things as you. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. Like, I really do feel like we're working towards the same goal, maybe from different angles, and so
Yes.
it's great to meet you and to see that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Like I said, you're the Christian I've been waiting to meet. I have, I put out the call years ago. I was like, hey, where are the people who are actually working in the Christian world to lower the temperature here, right? And it's taken me a while to find the folks who are actually out there doing it. Because you'll find ex-evangelicals and ex-Christians who are, who are pounding the pavement. But I know that there are more of you out there, and I am reaching out to those voices proactively right now because it's not just the non-believers or non-theists who are going to do something about all this. It's mainly going to be the believers just because of the numbers.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. All right. How do anybody who's watching this, how do they find you? How do they reach out to you? How do they contact you if they want to?
Yeah. So like you said, you can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I'm at BR Cremer on both Twitter and Instagram, and you can find me on Facebook too. I tend to post the similar things on all of those platforms, but then I have a free weekly newsletter, Into the Gray, and you can sign up for that. You can either email me directly, and maybe I'll give you my email to put in the show notes.
Yeah.
But you can either do that directly, or you can go to any one of my social media handles, and my newsletter is the very top post of every one of them, so you can sign up that way. And the beauty of the newsletter is that there's never a paywall, and we can talk one-on-one about issues that I write about every week. So you're not afraid of people piling on you on social media. It's more of a one-on-one conversation. So
awesome.
Those are the ways.
Awesome. All right. Well, yes, I will have those links in the show notes for you folks. Thank you very much for coming around and watching us gabber on at a mad rate for almost 2 hours now. It's been awesome.
Seriously.
All right. And we will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.